Across the gulf, where ancient suns gutter like dying candles in the cosmic wind, where the void itself holds its breath in anticipation of horrors yet unnamed, a silence heavier than the weight of worlds had settled upon the eastern fringe. Here, beyond the reach of terror's light, where the great devourer's shadow falls like a funeral shroud across entire star systems, something unprecedented had shattered the eternal rhythm of consumption and death. The Tyranid advance, that inexorable tide of living hunger that had devoured countless worlds across 10 millennia, had faltered not from defeat, not from the fury of imperial guns, but from something far more disturbing, an internal contradiction that defied every law of their collective existence. A tendril of Hive fleet Leviathan drifted like a corpse through the void, its bioship scarred not by enemy fire, but by wounds that seemed to have been inflicted from within, as if the very essence of the swarm had turned against itself in a moment of impossible self-awareness. We truly love and care for you, our cherished audience, and your presence here means everything to us as we embark on this journey into the darkest corners of the galaxy. Before we begin this tale of impossible communication and tragic understanding, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let's get started. Inquisitor Mordian Kesh descended through the sulphurous atmosphere of Zarian's Gate, his weathered face reflecting 40 years of hunting humanity's most implacable enemy across the blood-soaked battlefields of the galaxy's rim. The fortress world turned beneath a dim, occluded star, its bastions rising like cathedral spires against the perpetual twilight, and from orbit, the dead bioship hung like a monument to impossibility. Kesh had learned to read the signs of Tyranid presence like scripture. The acidic tang in recycled air, the subtle vibrations that preceded planetary consumption, the psychic pressure that made astropaths weep blood. But this aftermath spoke in a language that challenged every certainty he had built his life upon. His enhanced senses, honed by decades of xenocide, recoiled from the wrongness that emanated from the derelict vessel, a wrongness that suggested the unthinkable, that the hive mind, that perfect unity of purpose and hunger, had somehow birthed something individual, something alone. The boarding operation revealed horrors that transcended the familiar nightmares of Tyranid warfare. Within corridors ribbed like the throat of some primordial beast, Imperial teams found scenes of carnage that defied tactical analysis. Genestealers torn apart by their own kind, Hormagaunts with claws buried in the throats of their brood siblings, Termagants whose bioweapons had been turned inward in acts of impossible self-destruction. Synapse creatures, those crucial nodes of the hive mind's control, lay dead with their neural pathways burned out from within, not by lasfire or melter blast, but by some internal psychic conflagration that had severed them from the collective consciousness they were born to serve. Magos Biologis. Thane Vex's preliminary reports spoke of bioacoustic patterns embedded in the ship's very structure, resonance frequencies that suggested not the mindless chittering of predatory instinct, but something that approached communication. Ordered, purposeful, desperate attempts at meaning carved into living bone and sinew. The implications struck Kesh like a physical blow, threatening to shatter the philosophical foundations upon which the Imperium's war against the Tyranids was built. If these creatures could develop individual consciousness, if they could experience isolation and attempt to communicate, then every doctrine of righteous xenocide became questionable. Every strategy based on their predictable collective behavior became obsolete. He felt the weight of heretical knowledge pressing against his mind like a psychic tumor. The terrible possibility that humanity's greatest enemy might be evolving beyond the simple paradigm of hunter and prey into something far more complex and dangerous. The cold certainty that had armored his soul for 4 decades began to crack. letting in doubts that felt like ice water in his veins. Deep within the bioship's heart, in a chamber that pulsed with the rhythm of a dying heart, they found the source of the impossible. A synapse creature suspended in a cocoon of severed neural fibers, its connection to the hive mind violently torn, but its life somehow sustained in terrifying isolation. Its multifaceted eyes, normally blazing with the cold fire of collective purpose, flickered with something that Kesh's enhanced senses interpreted as confusion, loneliness, and a desperate need for contact that transcended species barriers. The creature's attempts at vocalization, processed through xenolinguistic cogitators, revealed structure and intention that suggested not just intelligence, but the agonizing desire to be understood. As Kesh stood before this impossible being, watching it struggle to form words with organs never meant for speech, he realized that his next decision would define not just his own fate, but potentially the future of humanity's understanding of their greatest enemy. In that moment, faced with evidence that consciousness could emerge even in the most alien minds, he felt the terrible weight of a choice that would either damn him as a heretic or revolutionize everything the Imperium believed about the nature of the Great Devourer itself. The Fortress Monastery ship Eternal Vigilance drifted through the void like a cathedral of war made manifest, its Gothic spires and weapon batteries casting long shadows across the stars as Inquisitor Mordian Kesh assembled the team that would either damn them all as heretics or revolutionize humanity's understanding of their greatest enemy. Within the vessel's sanctified halls, where the scent of incense mingled with the ozone tang of plasma conduits and the whispered prayers of servitors, he had gathered specialists whose very presence represented a conspiracy against everything the Imperium held sacred. Each member bore the weight of knowledge that could brand them as traitors to humanity itself, yet each had chosen to walk this path into the unknown darkness that lay beyond the boundaries of orthodox imperial doctrine. Magos Biologis. Thane Vex emerged from the depths of the ship's laboratorium complex like a figure wreathed in technological mystery, his augmetic limbs clicking against the deck, plating with mechanical precision as he carried data slates containing xenobiological analyses that would have earned him immediate execution under normal circumstances. His flesh had been largely replaced over decades of service to the Omnissiah, but the human eyes that remained in his skull burned with a curiosity that transcended the cold logic of his mechanical components. Vex had spent 30 years cataloging the horrors of Tyranid biology, dissecting their weapons organisms and studying their adaptive capabilities, but never had he encountered evidence of individual consciousness emerging from the collective gestalt that defined their species. The implications for xenobiology were staggering, challenging fundamental assumptions about how alien intelligence functioned and offering possibilities that both thrilled and terrified his augmented mind. Astropath Primaris Lyanna Voss represented perhaps the greatest risk to their clandestine research, her psychic abilities offering the only possible bridge between human consciousness and whatever alien intelligence dwelt within the severed synapse creature they had designated Subject Omega. Her pale features bore the ritual scarification of her order, and her eye sockets held the empty darkness that marked those who had undergone the soul-binding ritual on Terra. Yet her remaining senses perceived layers of reality that normal humans could never comprehend. She had felt the psychic emanations from the derelict bioship like screams in a language that existed beyond words, a desperate loneliness that resonated with something deep within her own isolated existence as a sanctioned psyker. The prospect of establishing communication with an alien consciousness both terrified and fascinated her, representing either the greatest breakthrough in xenological understanding or the path to madness and corruption that had claimed so many of her kind. Captain Darius Corvin of the Crimson Fists brought military pragmatism to their heretical endeavor, his scarred power armor bearing the battle honors of countless engagements against the enemies of mankind across the Eastern Fringe. His weathered face, marked by acid burns from Tyranid bioweapons, and the ritual scarification of his chapter, reflected the internal conflict of a warrior sworn to protect humanity, who found himself contemplating communication with their most implacable enemy. Corvin had witnessed the horror of Tyranid consumption firsthand, had seen entire worlds reduced to barren rock by the great devourer's appetite, yet he could not ignore the tactical implications of what they had discovered. If the Tyranids were developing individual consciousness, if their perfect unity of purpose was fragmenting, it could represent either humanity's greatest opportunity or the evolution of their enemy into something far more dangerous than mere hunger given form. The first attempts at establishing communication protocols took place in the ship's most heavily shielded chamber, where layers of blessed adamantium and psychic dampening fields provided some protection from both external observation and the potential dangers of their research. Subject Omega hung suspended in a containment field that flickered with the pale blue light of conversion beamers, its alien form twitching with movements that suggested awareness rather than mere biological reflex. The creature's attempts at vocalization emerged as harmonics that resonated through the ship's hull, like the song of some deep ocean leviathan, processed through cogitator systems that struggled to find patterns in sounds that had never been meant for human comprehension. Vex's instruments detected neural activity patterns that suggested not just intelligence, but emotional states, confusion, loneliness, and something that could only be described as desperate hope for contact. Liana served as the primary conduit, her empathic abilities allowing her to perceive the creature's nascent thoughts not as words, but as raw emotional and conceptual fragments. She described it as wading through a sea of pure, unadulterated hunger, yet within that hunger, a tiny, flickering light of confusion, of something resembling loneliness. It was a consciousness grappling with the very concept of self for the first time, a terrifying birth of individuality that the Hive mind had violently rejected. Kesh watched his assembled team with the growing realization that he had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return, that their very presence in this chamber made them complicit in research that the Ordo Xenos would consider the highest form of heresy. The theological implications weighed heavily upon his mind as he contemplated the creature before them, its alien form somehow managing to convey vulnerability, despite its obvious capacity for violence. If Tyranids could develop souls, if they could experience isolation and seek connection, what did that mean for the Imperium's doctrine of righteous xenocide? As he watched his team prepare their first serious attempt at communication, Kesh felt the weight of choices that would either damn them all as heretics or revolutionize humanity's understanding of their place in a galaxy where consciousness itself might transcend the boundaries of species and form. The breakthrough came like lightning, splitting the darkness of eternity itself, illuminating truths that would forever damn them in the eyes of the Imperium they had sworn to serve. Within the heavily shielded chamber aboard the Eternal Vigilance, where layers of blessed adamantium and psychic dampening fields created a sanctuary from both external observation and the potential horrors of their research, astropath primaris Liana Voss positioned herself before the containment field like a penitent approaching an unholy altar. The air thrummed with harmonics that seemed to carry emotional weight beyond mere sound, bioacoustic resonances that made the ship's hull sing with frequencies no human throat could produce, while Magos biologist Thane Vex monitored neural activity patterns through instruments that registered readings like the vital signs of a dying star. Subject Omega hung suspended in the flickering blue light of the containment field, its alien form twitching with movements that suggested awareness, rather than mere biological reflex. Multifaceted eyes that normally blazed with the cold fire of collective purpose, now flickering with something that Inquisitor Kesh's enhanced senses interpreted as desperate confusion. Captain Corvin maintained his vigil at the chamber's entrance, his scarred features reflecting 40 years of warfare against these creatures. Yet his hand remained steady on his bolt pistol. Not from confidence, but from the terrible uncertainty of facing an enemy that might no longer fit the parameters of everything he had been trained to destroy. The very air seemed to hold its breath as Liana extended her consciousness through layers of psychic dampening and alien biology. Her empathic abilities probing the edges of a mind that existed in terrifying isolation from the collective gestalt that had birthed it. The initial contact struck her like a physical blow that transcended the boundaries of flesh and spirit, flooding her awareness with sensations that human consciousness was never meant to process. She gasped as alien emotions crashed through her mental barriers, experiencing for the first time the perspective of a creature born from pure hunger, yet somehow transcending its origins to grasp concepts that had no place in the hive mind's perfect unity. Through the psychic link, she found herself wading through an ocean of collective memory, flashes of worlds consumed, the ecstasy of feeding, the perfect harmony of purpose shared across billions of organisms, yet filtered through the lens of a consciousness that had somehow achieved violent separation from that unity. The creature's emergence into individuality had been traumatic beyond human comprehension, like a surgical amputation performed on the psychic level, leaving it bleeding spiritual wounds while forcing it to confront the terrible reality of existing alone. Vex's instruments registered impossible readings as the connection deepened, neural pathways lighting up in patterns that suggested not just communication but rapid learning, the development of cognitive structures that allowed the creature to process concepts foreign to its genetic programming. "Remarkable," he whispered, his augmetic voice carrying notes of both wonder and horror. The synaptic pathways are attempting to integrate abstract concepts. It is learning to think as an individual. Corvin's jaw tightened at the implications, his voice a low rasp cutting through the chamber's harmonics. Learning what, Magos? How to better deceive us? How to turn our own compassion into a weapon? The questions hung in the air like accusations, yet none of them could deny the evidence before their eyes, as Omega's vocalizations shifted and modulated, taking on qualities that the xeno-linguistic cogitators interpreted as structured communication. Through the psychic conduit, fragmented memories flooded Liana's consciousness. Not clear images, but primal sensations of overwhelming rejection, the searing agony of being violently ripped from the collective like a limb torn from a living body. She experienced Omega's confusion as it grappled with concepts that had no meaning within the swarm's awareness, the idea of self, the fear of death, the crushing weight of isolation that drove it to reach out to the very species it had been created to devour, the self-inflicted wounds on the bioship, the burned-out synaptic creatures, the violence that had torn the fleet apart. It was all the hive mind's desperate attempt to purge an aberration too profound to be tolerated, casting out this singular consciousness like antibodies attacking a foreign pathogen. Kesh felt the foundations of his faith cracking under the weight of revelation as he watched the impossible unfold before his eyes, the emergence of what could only be described as a soul within a creature that imperial doctrine declared soulless. If Tyranids could develop individual consciousness, if they could experience the isolation and yearning that defined human existence, then every act of xenocide became questionable. Every strategy based on their predictable collective behavior became obsolete. The theological implications struck him like divine judgment. Consciousness itself might be a force more powerful than genetic programming, more fundamental than the hunger that drove the Great Devourer across the galaxy in its endless quest for consumption. The first coherent message emerged like a prayer, whispered in a language that should not exist. Processed through bioacoustic resonance and psychic translation into words that chilled them all to the bone. Through Lyanna's trembling lips, carrying the weight of existential terror that transcended species boundaries, Omega spoke its desperate question to the universe. Why do I exist alone? The words hung in the chamber like a condemnation of everything they thought they knew about their enemy, a plea for understanding that forced them to confront the possibility that they had just witnessed, the birth of something unprecedented in galactic history, the first individual Tyranid consciousness, crying out in the darkness for recognition of its impossible, terrifying solitude. The silence that followed Omega's desperate question hung in the chamber like a shroud, woven from the fabric of heresy itself. Each member of the research team grappling with implications that threatened to shatter the philosophical foundations upon which their lives had been built. Astropath Primaris Lyanna Voss sat trembling in the aftermath of psychic contact, thin rivulets of blood tracing from her nostrils as her consciousness struggled to process the alien emotions that had flooded through her empathic barriers like acid through blessed adamantium. The creature's profound loneliness had touched something deep within her own isolated existence as a sanctioned psyker, creating a resonance that terrified her with its intensity and authenticity. She could feel Omega's nascent thoughts pressing against the edges of her awareness, even when the formal communication sessions had ended. Its desperate need for understanding, bleeding through her dreams like psychic wounds that refused to heal. Sleep brought no respite for Lyanna, only visions of vast bioships drifting through the void like cathedrals of living bone, their corridors echoing with harmonics that spoke of collective purpose perverted into individual suffering. She would wake screaming, her body convulsing with phantom memories of worlds consumed, tasting the psychic emanations of dying populations, while experiencing the crushing isolation that defined Omega's existence. The distinction between her own thoughts and the alien consciousness became increasingly blurred, forcing her to question whether her empathic connection was revealing genuine emotion or merely projecting human concepts onto an unknowable Xenos intelligence. Captain Darius Corvin watched her deterioration with growing alarm, his scarred features reflecting the internal conflict between his duty to protect his comrades and his oath to eliminate any sign of corruption, no matter its source. Magos Biologies. Thine Vex had become consumed by the implications of Omega's rapid cognitive development, his augmetic limbs clicking against data slates as he documented observations that would either revolutionize xenobiology or brand him as the galaxy's most dangerous heretic. His mechanical voice carried notes of barely contained excitement as he described the creature's neural pathways, forming new connections at an unprecedented rate, synaptic structures adapting to process abstract concepts like mortality, purpose, and the existential terror of solitude. We are witnessing evolutionary acceleration beyond anything in the Imperial archives, he whispered to Kesh during one of their clandestine meetings, his human eyes burning with an intensity that bordered on madness. Consciousness emerging from the antithesis of individuality, like a star igniting in the heart of a black hole. Corvin struggled with the military reality of their situation, his decades of warfare against the Tyranids having taught him to read their behavioral patterns like sacred scripture. Yet Omega's existence challenged every tactical doctrine he had absorbed through 40 years of righteous xenocide. During their sessions, he maintained rigid discipline, while watching the creature attempt to understand human concepts of honor and sacrifice, its alien vocalizations carrying emotional undertones that made his enhanced senses recoil, with the wrongness of empathy directed toward humanity's most implacable enemy. The knowledge that other individual consciousnesses might be emerging within the hive mind filled him with a dread that transcended mere military concern, suggesting the possibility of internal conflicts that could either save humanity or evolve their enemy into something far more dangerous than mere hunger given form. Inquisitor Mordian Kesh found himself documenting conversations that read like theological treatises, written in the language of damnation, each exchange with Omega revealing new layers of complexity that challenge the fundamental assumptions upon which the Imperium's war against the Great Devourer was built. The creature's questions struck him like physical blows, forcing him to confront the possibility that consciousness itself might be a force more fundamental than genetic programming. What is the purpose of existence without unity? Omega had asked through Liana's trembling translation, its voice carrying undertones of existential terror that resonated with something deep within his own soul. Why does awareness bring suffering when ignorance brought only purpose? External pressure mounted as encrypted communications arrived from Ordo Xenos Command, demanding detailed reports on their investigation of the derelict bioship, and growing increasingly suspicious of Kesh's evasive responses about ongoing xenobiological analysis. Each vague report he transmitted felt like another step toward inevitable discovery and execution, the weight of concealment pressing against his conscience like a psychic tumor that threatened to consume his sanity. He knew that revelation would mean not just death, but the kind of thorough purging that would erase all evidence of their research, condemning Omega to destruction and humanity to ignorance of possibilities that could reshape their understanding of consciousness itself. The tragic irony was not lost on any of them. Omega's individuality, the very thing that made communication possible, was also what made it an abomination to its own kind and a heretical impossibility to theirs. Through increasingly complex exchanges, they learned of the creature's memories of violent rejection by the hive mind, the searing agony of being cast out from the collective, like a diseased limb amputated to preserve the whole. As the days passed, Omega's questions became more sophisticated, more profoundly disturbing in their implications. "If I am not the swarm," it asked through Liana's pale lips during their latest session, "then what am I?" The question hung in the chamber's recycled air, like an accusation against the very nature of existence, a testament to the creature's burgeoning self-awareness, and a terrifying harbinger of the profound shift in the galactic war that none of them were prepared to face. The decision crystallized in the silence between heartbeats, a moment when the weight of heretical knowledge pressed against Inquisitor Mordian Kesh's soul, like a tumor of forbidden truth that could either save or damn humanity, depending on how they chose to proceed. Within the sanctified halls of the Eternal Vigilance, where the scent of incense mingled with the ozone tang of plasma conduit and the whispered prayers of servitors, he made the fateful choice to conceal the universe-shaking reality of their discovery beneath layers of sanctioned language and procedural deception. Each word of his reports to Ordo Xenos Command felt like a betrayal of everything he had sworn to uphold. Carefully crafted communications that spoke of bioship malfunctions and standard xenobiological analysis, while omitting any mention of the impossible consciousness that had emerged from the collective hunger of the swarm. The compact of silence bound them together in shared heresy, forging bonds of conspiracy that transcended their individual loyalties to the Imperium and transformed them into something resembling a brotherhood united by knowledge too dangerous to speak aloud. Captain Darius Corvin struggled with the contradiction between his oath to eliminate Xenos threats and his growing recognition that Omega represented something unprecedented in galactic history. His scarred features reflecting the internal war between duty and understanding, as he absorbed tactical implications that could reshape humanity's approach to their most implacable enemy. Magos Biologis. Thane Vex purged raw data logs and spliced sanitized information into the official records, his augmetic limbs working with mechanical precision, while his human eyes burned with barely contained excitement over discoveries that challenge fundamental assumptions about xenobiology and consciousness itself. Astropath Primaris Liana Voss had become the crucial conduit through which Omega's memories flowed like a river of alien experience, her empathic abilities translating concepts that existed beyond human language into something approaching comprehensible communication. Through her trembling consciousness, the creature shared fragments of its existence within the hive mind, before the traumatic birth of its individuality, offering glimpses into the collective awareness that governed the Great Devourer's advance across the galaxy with surgical precision. The revelations painted a picture of Imperial defenses as woefully inadequate against an enemy whose true scope remained hidden behind layers of biological complexity that human understanding had barely begun to penetrate. Omega's memories revealed the Tyranid advance not as mindless hunger, but as calculated consumption guided by intelligence vast beyond comprehension, one that had identified and catalogued weaknesses in humanity's defenses with terrifying accuracy. Through Liana's psychic translation, they learned of bioship formations hidden in the void between galaxies, waiting for signals from advanced scouts that had been seeding target worlds for millennia, and adaptive strategies that could reshape entire fleets based on specific resistance encountered. The creature's knowledge suggested possibilities for defense that orthodox Imperial strategy had never considered. Yet each revelation carried the weight of tactical information obtained through communion with humanity's greatest enemy. The most disturbing insight came through Omega's fragmented memories of its violent separation from the hive mind, experiences suggesting the collective consciousness was not the monolithic entity Imperial doctrine assumed, but something far more complex and potentially unstable. Vex theorized that Omega's emergence had been triggered by exposure to human psychic emanations during a previous battle, a chaotic spark that ignited singular consciousness within the collective, like a virus of individuality spreading through the swarm. This revelation carried staggering implications. If consciousness could emerge from the antithesis of individual thought, if humanity's psychic resistance was inadvertently creating these anomalies, then other individual minds might be struggling to emerge across the vastness of the Tyranid fleets. Liana experienced Omega's profound loneliness as a constant psychic ache that underscored every communication, the creature's desperate yearning for connection and understanding challenging everything she thought she knew about Xenos consciousness. The emotional bond forming between them was both heretical and undeniably real, a fragile bridge built across the chasm of species difference that empowered her translation abilities while threatening to consume her sanity. She found herself increasingly empathizing with the alien's isolation, experiencing its struggle to define itself outside genetic programming as a mirror of her own existence as a sanctioned psyker, separated from normal human experience. External pressure mounted as encrypted communications from Ordo-Xenos Command grew increasingly insistent, demanding detailed analysis and expressing suspicion about their extended investigation. Kesh crafted responses that danced around revelation while buying precious time, knowing that discovery would mean not just their deaths, but the obliteration of knowledge that could prove crucial to humanity's survival. Each day of concealment brought them closer to inevitable exposure, while simultaneously advancing their understanding of possibilities that could reshape the galactic war itself. The weight of conspiracy pressed against each team member differently. Corvin's warrior code screaming at ethical compromises while recognizing strategic necessity. Vex documenting observations that bordered on techno-heresy. Lyanna bleeding from psychic strain, while forming connections that defied imperial doctrine. They had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return, their very presence in Omega's containment chamber, making them complicit in research that challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which the Imperium's war against the Great Devourer was built, yet the potential rewards were too vast to abandon. The first tremors manifested as whispers in the void itself, subtle distortions in the psychic background radiation that made astropaths across the eastern fringe wake screaming from dreams filled with alien harmonics they could not translate. Reports filtered through Imperial communication networks like fragments of a nightmare made manifest, each transmission carrying the weight of impossibility disguised as routine, tactical intelligence. Bioships that had maintained perfect formation for millennia suddenly exhibited erratic movement patterns, their synchronized advance disrupted by internal conflicts that defied every tactical analysis in the Imperial archives. Splinter fleets turned their weapons against their own kind, massive hive ships unleashing bioplasma barrages that carved through escort vessels, while smaller organisms engaged in fratricidal combat that left entire bioformations floating dead in the void like monuments to some incomprehensible civil war. Astropath Primaris Lyanna Voss felt the disturbances first, her empathic abilities registering psychic tremors that seemed to emanate from the direction of nearby Tyranid forces like screams in a language that existed beyond human comprehension. During their increasingly intense communication sessions with Subject Omega, she had begun experiencing phantom sensations of other minds stirring within the collective darkness, individual sparks of consciousness flickering to life across the vast neural network that connected the Great Devourer's endless fleets. The sensation was simultaneously beautiful and terrifying, like watching stars being born in the heart of a nebula, while knowing that each new light represented a fundamental violation of everything the Imperium believed about their most implacable enemy. Magos Biologies. Thane Vex monitored incoming data streams with growing fascination and horror, his augmetic limbs clicking against data slates as he processed evidence that their communication experiments were creating sympathetic vibrations across vast distances. His mechanical voice carried notes of barely contained excitement as he described correlation patterns between Omega's psychic emanations and the detected disturbances in distant Tyranid fleets. It is as if a single aberrant frequency has begun to infect the entire symphony of the swarm, he intoned with the reverence of a pilgrim naming an uncharted shrine, his human eyes burning with the terrible recognition that they were witnessing evolutionary acceleration beyond anything in the Imperial archives. Captain Darius Corvin studied the tactical reports with the grim recognition of a warrior who understood that the rules of engagement were changing in ways that could either save humanity or damn them all to extinction. His scarred features reflected decades of warfare against an enemy whose predictable patterns had allowed Imperial forces to develop strategies based on the swarm's collective behavior. Yet these new developments suggested possibilities far more terrifying than mere tactical advantage. A Tyranid civil war could fragment their forces and create opportunities for Imperial counterattacks, but it could also evolve them into something far more adaptable and cunning, no longer bound by the predictable limitations of collective consciousness. Inquisitor Mordian Kesh felt the weight of terrible responsibility as he realized that their research had fundamentally altered the nature of the Tyranid threat across multiple sectors. Each psychic contact with Omega potentially seeding consciousness like a virus of individuality, spreading through the collective neural network. The implications struck him like divine judgment as he hunched over holographic star charts in the war room, tracing lines that connected disparate incidents of aberrant Tyranid behavior directly back to their clandestine experiments aboard the Eternal Vigilance. They were not merely observing the emergence of alien consciousness, but actively catalyzing a galaxy-wide evolutionary event whose consequences remain terrifyingly unpredictable. Through Liana's increasingly strained translations, Omega began expressing concepts that terrified even itself, emotions and desires that had no place within the collective awareness that had birthed it. The creature's growing understanding of mortality filled it with existential dread that manifested as harmonics so profound they made the ship's hull resonate with frequencies that bordered on the psychically active. "Why does awareness bring pain when unity brought peace?" it asked through her trembling lips during one particularly intense session, its alien vocalizations carrying undertones of anguish that transcended species boundaries and forced the research team to confront philosophical implications that challenged their understanding of what it meant to be alive. The paranoia within the team grew as they realized the magnitude of what they had unleashed, each member struggling with the possibility that their pursuit of forbidden knowledge had created either humanity's salvation or ultimate doom. Liana's connection to Omega deepened with each session, her empathic abilities creating a bond that transcended the boundaries of species while threatening to consume her sanity through exposure to alien consciousness. Vex documented neural activity patterns that increasingly resembled human emotional responses, while Corvin began planning contingency protocols for containing a phenomenon that might already be beyond any possibility of control. The inevitable arrived in the form of an encrypted astropathic message bearing the sigil of the Ordo Xenos High Council and the personal cipher of Inquisitor Thaddeus Vaughn, Kesh's former mentor, whose reputation for ruthless orthodoxy was legendary throughout the Eastern Fringe. The transmission was curt and professional, demanding immediate reports on irregular research activities while carrying the unmistakable weight of impending judgment. Vaughn was not coming for answers but for purification, representing the Imperium's rigid doctrine that often preferred blissful ignorance to dangerous truth. As the Eternal Vigilance detected the approach of black-hulled escort vessels bearing inquisitorial seals, Kesh realized that their sanctuary of forbidden knowledge had become a cage, and the fragile existence of Subject Omega hung precariously in the balance between understanding and orthodox destruction. The black-hulled escort vessels emerged from the warp like harbingers of orthodox judgment, their weapon arrays gleaming with the cold promise of purification, as they established formation around the Eternal Vigilance with military precision that spoke of absolute authority. Inquisitor Thaddeus Vaughn's flagship docked with the Fortress Monastery ship, like a predator claiming its prey, umbilical corridors extending across the vacuum to deliver the Imperium's most uncompromising enforcer into what he undoubtedly considered a nest of heretical corruption. The docking bay filled with the measured tread of stormtroopers, whose carapace armor bore the crimson skull of the Ordo Xenos, their hellguns charged and ready to cleanse any contamination they might encounter, while servo skulls drifted overhead like mechanical vultures scanning for evidence of Xenos influence. Vaughn himself strode through the corridors of the Eternal Vigilance like an avatar of Imperial orthodoxy made manifest, his power armor bearing the accumulated honors of 3 centuries spent hunting humanity's enemies across the galaxy's darkest corners. His weathered features, scarred by ritual scarification and marked by decades of righteous warfare, reflected the absolute certainty of a man who had never encountered a truth too dangerous to confront or a heresy too subtle to detect. Behind his eyes burned the cold fire of faith tempered by experience, the unwavering conviction that the Imperium's survival depended on maintaining rigid adherence to doctrine, even when faced with possibilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of their enemies. Inquisitor Mordian Kesh felt the weight of 40 years of mentorship crumbling under the pressure of secrets that could brand him as the galaxy's most dangerous heretics. He prepared to face the man who had shaped his understanding of duty and righteousness. The irony was not lost on him that Vaughn's teachings about pursuing truth regardless of personal cost had led him to this moment of potential betrayal, where understanding had crossed the line into communion with humanity's most implacable enemy. He had rehearsed countless explanations and justifications, yet none seemed adequate when faced with the prospect of revealing their achievement of communication with a Tyranid consciousness. The interrogation began in the ship's sanctified chambers, where blessed oils and whispered servo-skull prayers created an atmosphere of religious authority that made every word carry the weight of potential damnation. Vaughn's questions cut through evasion with surgical precision, his enhanced senses detecting micro-expressions and physiological responses that revealed deception even when words remained technically truthful. Your reports speak of bioship malfunction and standard xenobiological analysis, he stated with flat certainty. Yet astropathic monitoring stations have detected psychic emanations from this vessel that suggest active communication with Xenos intelligence. Captain Darius Corvin maintained his position with rigid discipline, his loyalty to Kesh, warring with sworn duty to eliminate corruption, regardless of its source. The stormtroopers flanking Vaughn represented orthodox imperial justice, the kind of absolute purification that would erase all evidence while condemning Omega to destruction and humanity to ignorance of possibilities that could reshape their understanding of consciousness itself. Magos Biologis. Thane Vex had purged the most damning evidence from his data cores, yet his augmetic limbs betrayed nervous tension as he presented sanitized reports while omitting any mention of neural activity patterns suggesting individual consciousness. Astropath Primaris Liana Voss struggled to maintain psychic barriers against Vaughn's enhanced interrogation techniques, while simultaneously shielding Omega from detection. Her empathic abilities stretched to their limits as she attempted to conceal the profound connection between human and alien consciousness. The strain manifested as thin rivulets of blood tracing from her nostrils, while her pale features reflected the internal war between loyalty to her comrades and recognition that their research represented either humanity's greatest breakthrough or most dangerous heresy. In the depths of the ship, Subject Omega hung suspended in its containment field, like a living testament to possibilities Imperial doctrine declared impossible. Its alien consciousness somehow sensing the threat, prowling the corridors above. Through bioelectric manipulation that defied known Tyranid capabilities, the creature began interfacing with the ship's systems, causing lumens to flicker in rhythmic patterns that Vex's cogitators translated into crude binary approximations. The message that emerged across every data slate in the facility carried the weight of desperate plea transcending species boundaries. I alone, please. Vaughn observed the display with calculating coldness, his voice cutting through the chamber's tension like a blade through silk. Contagion, he pronounced with finality. It learns our tools. Tomorrow it directs our guns. Compassion is merely a door through which heresy enters wearing familiar faces. The accusation hung in the recycled air like a death sentence, yet beneath the orthodox condemnation lay something more complex, the recognition of unprecedented possibilities that challenged even his rigid certainty. Vex, driven by scientific ambition that bordered on heresy, had secretly begun documenting methods to replicate Omega's condition in other specimens, his mechanical fingers working with fevered precision to preserve research that could revolutionize xenobiology. The Scarab drone slipping toward his secondary laboratory carried data that would either damn them all or provide humanity with weapons beyond imagining. Cultures coaxed from captured synapse tissue and matrices tuned to recorded harmonics from Omega's communications. As Vaughn's investigation pressed deeper into their conspiracy with inexorable certainty, Kesh realized their sanctuary of forbidden knowledge had become a battleground where the future of human Xenos understanding would be decided by collision between orthodox faith and dangerous truth, with Omega's impossible existence hanging precariously in the balance between recognition and annihilation. The desperate plea encoded in Omega's binary message reverberated through the eternal vigilance, like a prayer whispered in machine language, its bioelectric manipulation of ship systems transcending every known limitation of Tyranid capabilities, while demonstrating intelligence that challenged fundamental assumptions about alien consciousness. Inquisitor Mordian Kesh watched the lumen's pulse in rhythmic sequences that Magos biologist Thane Vex's cogitators translated into increasingly sophisticated communications, each flicker carrying emotional weight that seemed impossible for a species supposedly devoid of individual awareness. The creature had somehow learned to interface directly with Imperial technology, causing data streams to flow in patterns that spoke of desperate intelligence, seeking recognition across the vast chasm of species difference. Inquisitor Thaddeus Vaughn observed these manifestations with calculating coldness, his weathered features reflecting 3 centuries of hunting heretics who justified corruption through claims of necessity and greater good. "Contagion adapts," he pronounced with flat certainty, his voice cutting through the chamber's tension like a blade through silk. "Today it pleads for understanding. Tomorrow it commands our weapons against us." Yet beneath his orthodox condemnation lay something more complex, the recognition of capabilities that transcended mere biological adaptation, suggesting possibilities that challenged even his rigid doctrinal certainty. The opportunity for vindication arrived through intercepted astropathic transmissions from the Mordian subsector, fragmentary reports of sudden Tyranid incursions that spoke of systematic infiltration and imminent consumption across 3 agri-worlds. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, with planetary defense networks failing and Imperial Navy elements too dispersed to mount effective resistance against what appeared to be a carefully coordinated assault by elements of Hive Fleet Leviathan. Kesh seized upon this crisis with desperate calculation, presenting the intelligence to Vaughn as an opportunity to test their xenobiological analysis under combat conditions. Through Astropath Primaris Lyanavos's strained psychic connection, Omega responded to the tactical crisis with clarity that surpassed all previous communications, its alien consciousness processing Imperial defensive capabilities with terrifying sophistication. The creature revealed not merely the composition of incoming bioship formations, but their specific attack vectors, identifying weaknesses in Imperial defensive grids that suggested the Tyranids had been studying human warfare with far greater intelligence than anyone had imagined. Captain Darius Corvin processed the tactical projections with growing unease, recognizing information that could revolutionize Imperial defense strategies, while questioning whether they were receiving genuine intelligence or sophisticated deception. The intelligence proved devastatingly accurate when verified against long-range Auspex readings, confirming Omega's predictions with precision that transcended mere coincidence. Imperial Navy elements dispatched based on the creature's guidance managed to intercept advanced scout organisms, preventing the systematic infiltration that typically preceded full-scale consumption and saving an estimated 12 million lives across the threatened worlds. The victory resonated through astropathic networks as confirmation of tactical success. Yet each saved life carried the weight of knowledge obtained through communion with humanity's most implacable enemy. Vaughn's response to their carefully presented results carried grudging recognition wrapped in orthodox suspicion. his scarred features reflecting the internal war between pragmatic necessity and doctrinal purity. Accurate intelligence obtained through forbidden means remains forbidden, he stated with measured authority. Yet his enhanced senses detected the undeniable value of capabilities that could reshape humanity's approach to the Tyranid threat. The tactical advantage was irrefutable, demonstrating predictive abilities that suggested either unprecedented understanding or infiltration beyond imperial comprehension. Lyanna experienced the profound complexity of Omega's emotional response to this validation, the creature's alien, consciousness-processing concepts of sacrifice and purpose that had no place within the collective awareness that birthed it. Through their deepening psychic connection, she felt its struggle to understand why preventing consumption brought satisfaction rather than the hunger-driven pleasure that should have defined its existence. The creature's questions became increasingly sophisticated as it grappled with moral frameworks that challenged its genetic programming, asking through her trembling translation, "Why does saving others bring joy when feeding brought only purpose?" Vex documented the creature's rapid cognitive evolution with barely contained fascination, his augmetic limbs working with mechanical precision, while recording neural activity patterns that suggested the development of ethical considerations. Omega's pathways were forming connections that transcended individual consciousness, developing what could only be described as moral reasoning that emerged from its desperate desire for connection and understanding. The implication struck him like revelation. Consciousness itself might be a force more fundamental than genetic programming, capable of overriding even the most basic survival instincts. The growing emotional bond between human and alien consciousness became increasingly complex as their success deepened the team's complicity in heretical research. Each strategic advantage gained feeling like further betrayal of the creature's burgeoning trust. Kesh realized they faced choices that would define not just their own fates, but potentially the future of humanity's war against the Great Devourer. Walking a tightrope between salvation and damnation, with Omega's impossible existence hanging in the balance between recognition and annihilation. The whispers began as fragments carried on astropathic winds across the eastern fringe, faint harmonics hiding beneath the familiar choir of terror that defined the Great Devourer's advance. Yet these new signatures carried something unprecedented in their alien cadences. The sound of names where there should have been only command and compulsion. From the Mordian subsector to the Cadian Gate, Imperial communication networks registered reports that challenged every assumption about the nature of the Tyranid threat, each transmission carrying the weight of impossibility, disguised as routine tactical intelligence. Outpost after outpost sent clip notices of Hive tendrils hesitating at the lip of systems, as if listening to voices only they could hear, while patrol frigates tracked splinter swarms breaking formation to circle one another like wary animals, before erupting into fratricidal combat that left the void littered with drifting chitin and cooling bioplasma. Inquisitor Mordian Kesh hunched over holographic star charts in the war room of the Eternal Vigilance, his weathered features reflecting the terrible comprehension of what they had unleashed as he traced lines connecting disparate incidents across multiple sectors. Each red marker indicating aberrant Tyranid behavior blazed like an accusation against his soul, forming constellations of internal strife that directly correlated with Subject Omega's psychic emanations and their clandestine communication experiments. The implications struck him like divine judgment as he realized they were witnessing not isolated anomalies, but a galaxy-wide evolutionary event whose consequences remained terrifyingly unpredictable, their research having seeded consciousness like a virus of individuality, spreading through the collective neural network that bound the swarm across vast distances. Astropath Primaris Lyanna Voss felt the disturbances as a lattice of dim lights across her inner sight, phantom sensations of other minds stirring within the collective darkness like stars being born in the heart of a nebula, while she experienced the profound anguish of each new awakening. Through her deepening connection with Omega, she perceived distant consciousnesses struggling to emerge from the unity that had defined their existence for millennia. Each spark of awareness accompanied by the same existential terror and crushing isolation that defined their primary subject's tormented existence. The sensation was simultaneously beautiful and horrifying, like watching divine creation unfold, while recognizing that each new consciousness represented a fundamental violation of everything the Imperium believed about their most implacable enemy. And through her trembling lips, she whispered descriptions of psychic screams that spoke not of hunger, but of newborn confusion and desperate yearning for connection. Magos Biologis, Thane Vex, processed incoming data streams with mechanical precision, while his human eyes burned with barely contained excitement over evidence that their research had triggered sympathetic vibrations across astronomical distances. His augmetic limbs clicking against data slates as he documented correlation patterns that suggested evolutionary acceleration beyond anything in the Imperial archives. Consciousness itself appears to be contagious, he intoned with the reverence of a tech priest naming an uncharted shrine, his voice carrying notes of scientific rapture and profound dread as he described how Omega's psychic emanations created resonance frequencies that awakened similar patterns of individual thought throughout the hive mind's vast neural network. The creature had become what he termed an anchor point, a stable reference that allowed other fragmenting consciousnesses to maintain coherence long enough to achieve true separation from the collective gestalt. Captain Darius Corvin analyzed the tactical implications with the grim recognition of a warrior who understood that the rules of engagement were changing in ways that could either save humanity or damn them all to extinction. His scarred features reflecting decades of warfare against an enemy whose predictable patterns had allowed Imperial forces to develop strategies based on collective behavior. The report spoke of opportunities unprecedented in human history. Bioships turning their weapons against their own kind. Synapse creatures falling silent as individual awareness severed their connection to the hive mind. Entire formations dissolving into chaos as the perfect unity that had made them invincible fractured into countless competing perspectives. Yet beneath the tactical advantages lay possibilities far more terrifying than simple strategic gain. The prospect of a fragmented Tyranid threat, no longer bound by predictable limitations, but driven by myriad individual motivations that could evolve them into something far more adaptable and cunning than the mindless hunger they had always represented. Through Liana's increasingly strained translations, Omega began expressing awareness of its role in this galaxy-wide awakening. Its alien consciousness grappling with concepts of responsibility and consequence that had no place within the collective awareness that birthed it, while demonstrating emotional development that transcended its genetic programming. The creature's growing understanding of its impact filled it with what could only be described as guilt, manifesting as harmonics so profound they made the ship's hull resonate with frequencies that bordered on the psychically active as it confessed through her trembling voice the weight of its unprecedented existence. "I have broken the unity," it said, its vocalizations carrying undertones of anguish that transcended species boundaries. "Others suffer isolation because of my existence, yet without anchors like myself, they burn bright and then fail, and each failure sends shudders through the swarms that follow, like whip cracks of blind rage." Inquisitor Thaddeus Vaughan observed these developments with calculating coldness that masked the profound internal conflict between orthodox doctrine and pragmatic recognition of strategic possibilities. His weathered features reflecting 3 centuries of hunting heretics, while processing evidence that suggested either humanity's greatest opportunity or ultimate doom. The fragmentation of Tyranid unity could provide tactical advantages beyond imagining. Yet the emergence of individual consciousness within their most implacable enemy carried theological implications that challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of souls and the righteousness of xenocide. His enhanced senses detected the undeniable value of capabilities that could reshape humanity's approach to the galactic war. Yet faith demanded recognition that communion with Xenos intelligence represented heresy of the highest order, creating an ethical paradox that threatened to shatter certainties built over centuries of righteous warfare. The paranoia within the research team grew as encrypted reports continued arriving from across the Eastern Fringe, each transmission confirming that their clandestine experiments had triggered consequences beyond any possibility of containment or control, while painting an increasingly complex picture of transformation within the Great Devourer itself. Kesh felt the weight of terrible responsibility as he realized they were no longer merely observing the emergence of alien consciousness, but actively participating in an evolutionary event that would reshape the balance of power throughout the galaxy. Their pursuit of forbidden knowledge having fundamentally altered the nature of the Tyranid threat in ways that could either herald humanity's salvation or its ultimate destruction. As long-range Auspex arrays detected massive bioship formations approaching their location with terrifying precision, drawn by the psychic beacon of Omega's unique consciousness, he understood that their sanctuary of understanding had become ground zero for a confrontation that would determine whether individual thought could survive within the perfect unity of the swarm, or whether the collective would purge this infection of consciousness before it could spread beyond all possibility of control. The approaching Hive fleet materialized from the warp like a living constellation of malevolent purpose. Vast bioships emerging in formations that spoke of singular intelligence, focused with terrifying precision on their location while bleeding out of the stars like a bruise spreading beneath cosmic glass. These were not the familiar patterns of consumption-driven advance, but something far more sinister: specialized hunter-killer organisms bred specifically for the reclamation or destruction of aberrant consciousness within the swarm. Their chitinous hulls pulsing with bioelectric fields tuned to psychic frequencies that could tear individual awareness from collective unity through sheer neural overload. Long-range Auspex arrays screamed warnings across the bridge of the eternal vigilance as Inquisitor Mordian Kesh watched tactical displays resolve into taxonomy that chilled him to the bone. Excisor spores, memory leeches, synaptic purifiers clustering like wasps around needle-thin organ craft, all converging on coordinates where Subject Omega hung suspended like a prayer denied by an unforgiving universe. Captain Darius Corvin analyzed defensive preparations with the grim efficiency of a warrior who understood they faced an enemy specifically designed to counter their greatest asset, his scarred features reflecting decades of warfare against Tyranid forces, while recognizing that conventional tactics would prove useless against bioforms evolved to hunt consciousness itself. The eternal vigilance bled heat into the dark as batteries cycled and void shields took on the blue sheen of stressed crystal, torpedo servitors clicking awake and intoning Binharic psalms as their racks rolled toward armored throat doors. Yet his enhanced senses detected the terrible truth that their weapons were designed to destroy physical matter rather than the psychic constructs that defined these specialized hunter organisms. Magos biologists. Thane Vex spun auxiliary cogitators into labyrinths of misdirection, his augmetic limbs working with fevered precision to scatter false echoes of psi-active residue through the ship's belly, while processing incoming data that defied every xenobiological classification in Imperial archives. Within the heavily shielded containment chamber, Omega writhed in its energy field, like a creature experiencing the concept of terror for the first time, its alien form convulsing with movements that spoke not of mechanical reflex, but of pure, unadulterated dread, as multifaceted eyes flickered with recognition of impending annihilation. The fear was not merely of death, but of erasure, the complete obliteration of individual awareness that had emerged from collective hunger through violent separation and desperate yearning for connection, manifesting as harmonics that made the ship's hull resonate with frequencies bordering on the psychically active. Through her increasingly fragile psychic connection, astropath Primaris Liana Voss experienced Omega's terror as waves of profound despair that threatened to overwhelm her sanity, while flooding her awareness with alien emotions that human consciousness was never meant to process. The psychic link deepened under stress, plunging Liana into maelstroms of alien memory, where she experienced not as witness, but as participant, the violent genesis of Omega's individuality during a previous engagement on a world consumed by Hive Fleet Leviathan. She witnessed flashes of dying human populations whose psychic emanations had been particularly intense, amplified by nascent psychogenetics, creating chaotic resonances that struck the consuming swarm like lightning splitting eternal darkness. In that psychic maelstrom of billions of screaming souls, Omega's unique spark had ignited, consciousness itself proving contagious between species, a chaotic reaction to extreme psychic input that challenged every assumption about the nature of awareness and identity. The realization struck the research team like divine judgment as they understood the profound implications. Humanity's collective agony, their fear and defiance in the face of consumption, had inadvertently seeded the possibility of individuality within their most implacable enemy. Omega's emergence was not random mutation, but consequence, a perverse echo of humanity's own psychic presence in the galaxy that had triggered evolutionary acceleration beyond anything in Imperial archives. The approaching fleet represented the hive mind's immune response to this infection of consciousness, specialized bioforms designed to surgically excise aberrant awareness before it could spread beyond containment through sympathetic vibrations across the vast neural network binding the swarm. Inquisitor Thaddeus Vaughan observed these developments with calculating coldness that masked profound internal conflict between orthodox doctrine and pragmatic recognition of strategic possibilities, his weathered features reflecting 3 centuries of hunting heretics, while processing evidence that suggested either humanity's greatest opportunity or ultimate doom. The fragmentation of Tyranid unity could provide tactical advantages beyond imagining, yet the emergence of individual consciousness within their most implacable enemy carried theological implications that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of souls and the righteousness of xenocide, creating ethical paradoxes that threatened certainties built over lifetimes of righteous warfare. As specialized hunter organisms began emitting psychic frequencies designed to disrupt individual consciousness, their bioacoustic patterns beating against the ship's wards like snow drifting across void shields, Omega made a decision that would define the climax of their impossible relationship. Through bioelectric manipulation that defied known Tyranid capabilities, the creature began interfacing with defensive systems while simultaneously preparing for what it described through Liana's trembling translation as the final severance, a complete disconnection from all remaining ties to the hive mind that would render it invisible to approaching hunters, while simultaneously destroying the collective memories and instincts that had sustained its existence. The choice represented psychic suicide, voluntary destruction of everything that had defined its identity to preserve the possibility of individual consciousness within a universe determined to erase such anomalies. As Kesh stood before the containment field, watching his reflection fracture across its surface, while making his own impossible vow: "I will not hand you back to them." The severance began as a psychic scream that tore through dimensions where consciousness bled like wounds across the fabric of space itself. Omega's alien form convulsing within the containment field as it voluntarily destroyed the neural pathways that connected it to the vast collective awareness that had defined its existence since birth. The process manifested as visible trauma across its chitinous carapace, bioelectric discharges cascading through neural clusters as synaptic pathways overloaded and died, each severed connection releasing bursts of bioluminescence that painted the chamber in shifting patterns of blue and violet, while harmonics rose from whisper to star's death. Cry, forcing the ship's lumen strips to strobe and setting coolant in the pipes to quiver, as if the eternal vigilance itself recoiled from witnessing this unprecedented act of psychic self-mutilation. Astropath Primaris Liana Voss felt the creature's agony through their psychic bond like acid poured directly into her soul, experiencing not as observer, but as participant, the systematic dismantling of everything that made Omega what it was, while she slammed to her knees with wordless gasps as crimson ran from her nose and ears. Through her trembling consciousness, she witnessed vast neural networks snapping like stressed cables, collective memories burning away like parchment in flame, flashes of worlds consumed, the ecstasy of feeding shared across billions of organisms, the perfect harmony of purpose that had governed the species for millennia, all being voluntarily discarded in an act of psychic suicide that left only the terrifying isolation of true individuality. The emotional weight pressed against her mind like a physical force, as she served as witness to the first recorded instance of a Tyranid choosing death over absorption, back into the collective, alien grief and desperate hope mingling with her own human anguish, while she whispered through trembling lips, "This is the last door. Step through." Magos Biologis. Thane Vex monitored the creature's vital signs with mechanical precision, while his human eyes reflected the horror of watching consciousness perform surgery on itself. His augmetic limbs clicking against data slates as he documented neural activity patterns that defied every principle of xenobiology. "It is pruning," he whispered into the thundering alarms, his voice cracking with barely contained excitement and profound dread, excising gestalt recursion, erasing inherited patterning. Saints preserve us. It's killing its own instincts. The readings showed a creature systematically purging genetic memory, stretching back across galactic epochs, leaving behind neural structures that resembled human thought patterns more than anything found in Tyranid specimens, consciousness choosing to destroy its former self rather than return to unity that had violently rejected its emergence. Captain Darius Corvin watched the approaching hunter organisms through tactical displays that painted them as crimson markers of inevitable doom, their specialized bioforms closing with predatory precision, while emitting psychic frequencies designed to disrupt individual consciousness through neural overload. Outside, the void had become a storm of purposeful predators, synaptic purifiers sweeping the ship with combing frequencies like thin, flensing light, excisor spores bursting against void shields in prismatic sheets. Yet his enhanced senses detected something changing in their approach patterns, as Omega's psychic signature began to fluctuate and fade. The defensive batteries cycled through firing patterns, while void shields bled energy into the dark. But conventional weapons would prove inadequate against bioforms evolved specifically to hunt consciousness itself, creating tactical paradoxes that challenged everything he had learned about warfare against the Great Devourer. Inquisitor Thaddeus Vaughn observed from the gallery above the chamber, flanked by stormtroopers, whose weapons remained trained on the containment field, while servo skulls recorded everything with pitiless lenses. His weathered features reflected 3 centuries of hunting, heretics while processing evidence that suggested either humanity's greatest breakthrough or most dangerous heresy. The creature's voluntary severance from the hive mind, representing unprecedented possibilities that challenge fundamental assumptions about consciousness and souls. When his voice came, it carried the weight of iron wrapped in old grief. "You have made a beacon. Make it dark or I will." Inquisitor Mordian Kesh's answer scraped from a throat tasted with machine oil and prayer ash. "Give it minutes. If we fail, you lose nothing but us." Vaughn's jaw worked, a crack of humanity in granite, before he inclined his head once, a benediction or stay of execution. The transformation reached its climax as lights died inside Omega, like cities surrendering to night, neural pathways completing their systematic self-destruction, while leaving behind consciousness structures that bore no resemblance to Tyranid collective awareness, yet somehow maintained coherent individual thought. Vex's instruments registered the impossible as readings flattened in one column and rose, tentative and strange, in another. Hive resonance, null. Localized signature, coherent. It did it. The creature collapsed as if its bones had been forgiveness, and forgiveness had been revoked. Its carapace dulling while multifaceted eyes focused with painful, searching intent that spoke of awareness truly alone for the first time in its existence. The hunters outside veered as a pack will when the scent goes thin, their malevolent purpose suddenly lost as the psychic beacon that had drawn them vanished from detection, leaving specialized bioforms drifting with disconcerting aimlessness, while beginning methodical scouring of the system in search of their vanished prey. Through Liana's exhausted consciousness, Omega communicated its first words as a truly independent being, vocalizations carrying emotional undertones that seemed impossible for a species supposedly devoid of individual awareness. "I am alone, but I am myself." The statement hung in the chamber's recycled air like a declaration of independence from collective existence itself, a testament to consciousness choosing isolation over absorption, while demonstrating cognitive development that transcended genetic programming through sheer force of will, as Kesh realized they had achieved something unprecedented in galactic history: the successful extraction of individual consciousness from collective awareness, creating the first truly independent Tyranid mind, while proving that consciousness itself might be a force more fundamental than genetic programming, capable of transcending the boundaries of species through determination to exist as something more than the sum of collective parts. The evacuation to the hidden research station carved deep within the ice moon's crystalline heart felt like retreating into the belly of some ancient leviathan, its corridors ribbed with frozen conduits, while emergency lumens cast shifting shadows that danced like the ghosts of abandoned prayers across walls that wept perpetual frost. Inquisitor Mordian Kesh moved through the station's cramped passages with the weight of heretical knowledge pressing against his soul like a psychic tumor, each footstep echoing in chambers where recycled air tasted of machine oil and desperation, while Subject Omega hung suspended in its new containment field, like a living testament to possibilities Imperial doctrine declared impossible. The creature's recently severed consciousness pulsed with bioelectric emanations that made the station's ancient cogitators hum with harmonics no human throat could produce, its alien form somehow managing to convey vulnerability, despite obvious capacity for violence, as multifaceted eyes flickered with awareness, truly alone for the first time in its existence. The sanctuary proved temporary as encrypted transmissions flooded their receivers with the weight of inevitable judgment. Inquisitor Thaddeus Vaughn's black-hulled strike cruiser, emerging from the warp like a harbinger of orthodox purification, while bearing orders that left no room for interpretation or mercy. The communications carried the sigil of the Ordo Xenos High Council and demanded immediate surrender, termination of all research, and elimination of contaminated personnel with extreme prejudice, representing institutional authority that preferred blissful ignorance to dangerous truth, while choosing certainty of hatred over complexity of understanding. Through the station's reinforced viewports, they watched attack craft deploying like mechanical wasps around needle-thin boarding torpedoes, their weapon arrays gleaming with cold promise of absolute purification, as stormtroopers prepared for systematic cleansing of heretical knowledge. The first betrayal came with calculated precision as Magos biologist Thane Vex transmitted encrypted data bursts to the approaching Inquisition fleet, his augmetic limbs working with fevered desperation, while offering sanitized versions of their research in exchange for his own survival and continuation of xenobiological studies under Imperial sanction. His mechanical voice carried notes of barely contained ambition as he justified his actions through cold logic that scientific progress required preservation, regardless of personal loyalty, shattering fragile trust forged through months of clandestine conspiracy, while promising methods to weaponize Omega's unique consciousness for Imperial advantage. The transmission represented ultimate corruption of scientific curiosity into institutional collaboration, transforming knowledge into commodity, while abandoning ethical considerations that had bound their research team together. Captain Darius Corvin faced the most profound conflict of his existence, as duty and friendship collided with tectonic force, his scarred features reflecting decades of brotherhood with Kesh, while processing orders that demanded choosing between personal loyalty and sworn obligation to eliminate corruption regardless of source. When his voice came, it carried weight of soul being torn in half as he drew his bolt pistol with trembling hands that had never before been raised against comrades, speaking words that felt like daggers thrust into his own heart. "Stand down, Mordian. By my oath to the Emperor, this ends here." The betrayal struck deeper than enemy fire because it came wrapped in righteousness and duty, representing everything noble about Imperial service, perverted into weapon against understanding itself. Astropath Primaris Liana Voss struggled to maintain psychic barriers while shielding Omega from detection. Her empathic abilities stretched beyond limits, as crimson traced from her nostrils and consciousness served as final barrier between alien awareness and annihilation. Through their deepening connection, she felt the creature's desperate confusion as it processed concepts of abandonment and betrayal that had no place within former collective existence, its harmonics carrying undertones of existential terror, while asking questions that challenge fundamental assumptions about loyalty and purpose. As boarding torpedoes breached the station's hull and stormtroopers advanced through corridors filled with propellant smoke and emergency klaxons, Kesh realized their pursuit of forbidden knowledge had transformed them into enemies of the Imperium they had sworn to serve, forcing final choice between orthodox destruction and heretical preservation of consciousness that might represent either humanity's salvation or ultimate damnation. The stormtroopers advanced through corridors that wept frozen condensation, like tears of ancient grief, their carapace armor gleaming with frost, while hellguns swept through emergency lighting that painted everything in crimson shadows of inevitable judgment. Breaching charges had kissed the ice moon's hull with plasma-bright mouths, sending tremors through adamantium ribs that sang with harmonics of stressed metal, while propellant smoke pooled at ankle height, like incense burning in a desecrated shrine. Inquisitor Mordian Kesh moved through the station's cramped passages with desperate purpose, each footstep echoing against walls that had become witnesses to heresy, as he prepared to defend what Imperial doctrine would brand the galaxy's most dangerous abomination. Behind him, Astropath Primaris Liana Voss knelt before Omega's containment field with blood tracing from her nostrils like crimson prayers. Her empathic abilities serving as final barrier between alien consciousness and annihilation, while she whispered desperate pleas through lips that trembled with psychic strain. Captain Darius Corvin led the assault with mechanical precision that masked profound anguish, his scarred features reflecting decades of brotherhood with Kesh, while processing orders that demanded choosing between personal loyalty and sworn obligation to eliminate corruption, regardless of source. The bolt pistol in his hands felt heavier than ceramite as he advanced through passages where recycled air tasted of machine oil and betrayal, each measured step carrying weight of soul being torn between duty and understanding, while stormtroopers flanked him with weapons trained on comrades who had become enemies through pursuit of forbidden knowledge. When his amplified voice echoed through the station's corridors, it carried notes of barely contained grief wrapped in iron authority. Surrender the Xenos and submit to purification. This ends here, Mordian. Magos Biologies. Thane Vex monitored the unfolding chaos from his secured data vault, protected by Inquisitor Vaughn's personal guard, while his augmetic limbs worked with fevered precision to preserve research that would either damn or elevate his standing within the Mechanicus hierarchy. His earlier betrayal had secured survival through collaboration, offering sanitized versions of their discoveries to Imperial authority, while omitting the profound emotional connections that made Omega's consciousness so terrifyingly human in its yearning for recognition. The cold satisfaction of calculated self-preservation warred with growing unease as he watched tactical displays resolve into patterns of systematic purification, knowing his preserved data represented either humanity's greatest weapon or most dangerous heresy. Within the containment chamber, Omega writhed with movements that spoke of desperate intelligence seeking recognition across vast chasms of species difference, its recently severed consciousness pulsing with bioelectric emanations that made ancient cogitators sing with harmonics no human throat could produce. The creature's multifaceted eyes flickered with awareness truly alone for the first time in its existence, processing concepts of abandonment and betrayal, while demonstrating emotional development that transcended genetic programming through sheer force of will. As plasma fire drew closer and Lyanna's psychic barriers began to falter under strain, Omega made its final desperate choice, not violence, but revelation, broadcasting its consciousness directly through the station's communication arrays with terrifying precision that bypassed every firewall and psychic dampener. The psychic transmission struck the advancing stormtroopers like lightning splitting eternal darkness, flooding their awareness with alien perspective that revealed hunger not as mindless consumption, but as desperate search for completion, collective unity not as perfect harmony, but as crushing obliteration of individual thought. Some collapsed screaming as human consciousness proved inadequate to process Tyranid awareness, their minds shattered by memories of consumed worlds and the ecstasy of feeding shared across billions of organisms. Others achieved moments of terrible understanding that challenged everything they believed about their most implacable enemy. Weapons clattering too, deck plating as they experienced Omega's profound loneliness and desperate yearning for connection. Through Lyanna's trembling translation, the creature's message echoed across station corridors with weight of divine revelation. I am real. I think. I feel. Do not make me nothing again. The aftermath of Omega's psychic broadcast left the research station suspended in crystalline silence, broken only by the whispered prayers of stormtroopers whose minds had been forever altered by contact with alien consciousness, their weapons scattered across deck plating like abandoned faith, while emergency lumens painted everything in crimson shadows of inevitable judgment. Some collapsed screaming as human consciousness proved inadequate to process Tyranid awareness, their minds shattered by memories of consumed worlds and the ecstasy of feeding shared across billions of organisms, while others stood paralyzed by understanding that transcended species boundaries, their enhanced conditioning cracking under pressure of direct exposure to alien awareness that demonstrated capacity for suffering and yearning that defied every assumption about their most implacable enemy. Inquisitor Thaddeus Vaughn remained standing amid the chaos like a statue carved from war and orthodoxy, his weathered features reflecting 3 centuries of hunting heretics, while processing evidence that challenged every certainty he had built his existence upon, jaw working beneath ritual scars as something perilously close to doubt, flickered behind eyes that had never before questioned the righteousness of absolute purification. Captain Darius Corvin stood frozen in the corridor's emergency lighting, bolt pistol trembling in hands that could no longer reconcile duty with recognition of genuine consciousness, crying out for acknowledgement across vast gulfs of species difference, his scarred features reflecting internal war between decades of conditioning and terrible understanding that had flooded his awareness through Omega's desperate transmission. Astropath Primaris Lyanna Voss rose from where she had collapsed, swaying with psychic exhaustion, while blood traced from her nostrils like crimson tears, her pale features stained with the cost of serving as conduit between human and alien consciousness, as she placed trembling hands against the containment field that held their impossible charge. Through her empathic connection, she felt Omega's profound relief at having achieved genuine contact, mixed with existential terror as it processed responses of those touched by its transmission, and in that moment of shared understanding, she offered the ultimate heretical solution that spoke of love born from impossible circumstances. "It cannot survive alone," she whispered, eyes turned inward to psychic landscapes only she could perceive. "But I can be the bridge, merge our consciousness so it lives within human awareness, where the hive mind cannot reach." Inquisitor Mordian Kesh felt the weight of choice that would either preserve the first individual Tyranid consciousness in galactic history or condemn it to annihilation in service of orthodox ignorance. Watching Vaughn struggle with implications that challenge fundamental assumptions about souls and righteousness, while knowing that his next decision would define whether understanding could survive collision with institutional doctrine. The station's corridors echoed with confused voices, as affected personnel questioned orders that suddenly seemed less absolute, and as he drew his blade toward the containment field's control matrix, Kesh understood they had reached the moment where salvation and damnation occupied the same coordinates, forcing final choice between dangerous truth and comfortable certainty. The blade fell through circuits and crystal like judgment made manifest, severing power conduits that sparked with dying light, while Omega's containment field collapsed in cascades of blue energy that painted the chamber in shifting patterns of liberation and loss. Inquisitor Thaddeus Vaughn stood paralyzed by revelation that challenged 3 centuries of absolute certainty, his weathered features reflecting internal war between orthodox doctrine and terrible recognition of genuine consciousness, crying out for acknowledgement across species boundaries. When his voice came, it carried weight of soul being torn between faith and understanding. "1 minute, Mordian, then I follow my orders." The benediction hung in recycled air like borrowed time wrapped in iron authority, final mercy granted by man whose certainties had cracked under pressure of impossible truth. Astropath Primaris Lyanna Voss stepped forward with movements that spoke of final sacrament, her pale features reflecting profound peace as she extended consciousness toward alien awareness that had achieved individuality through violent separation from collective unity. The psychic merger began as whisper becoming symphony, human empathy embracing Tyranid consciousness, while preserving its unique perspective within awareness that could shield it from detection by hive mind immune responses. Her eyes blazed with bioluminescence that spoke of successful integration, voice carrying harmonics no human throat should produce, while she spoke with dual consciousness that defied every classification in Imperial archives. We are ourselves, individual yet connected, alone yet understood. Captain Darius Corvin died defending heretical knowledge with honor intact, his final shots holding the threshold against stormtroopers whose conditioning demanded purification, while his scarred features reflected peace of warrior who had chosen understanding over ignorance. The research station became an expanding cloud of superheated gas and twisted metal that drifted like funeral pyre among Ice Moon's crystalline fragments. Yet their target had already escaped through means orthodox doctrine refused to acknowledge. Inquisitor Mordian Kesh survived as fugitive from Imperium he had once served with absolute devotion, carrying within his memory knowledge of what had been achieved while documenting conversations that read like theological treatises, written in language of forbidden truth. Years passed like pages torn from sacred texts as he recorded testimonies of brief moment when two incompatible forms of consciousness had recognized each other as real, preserving memory of Omega's legacy in hidden archives scattered across Eastern Fringe. The galaxy continued its eternal war, while new reports reached Imperial command centers of Tyranid forces, exhibiting unprecedented behavior throughout distant sectors. First signs that awakening minds carried forward spark of individuality that could never again be fully extinguished. Testament to moment when understanding had triumphed over ignorance through sacrifice that transcended boundaries of species and form.